Hello! Today we are reading chapter 12 of the Shakespeare Stealer. 12 and 13. And for vocab words, we have hot boy, Hautboy, which means oboe. And innocuous, safe, causing no harm. I hung back, very nearly resolved to flee and take my chances with Falconer. Had I known where he was, or I, even on my own in that unknown city. But just then Sander turned and beckoned to me with such a cheerful and friendly countenance that I swallowed my misgivings and followed him inside the lesson-room. The scene within was not at all what I had expected. There were no sullen students lined up on the benches with slates in their hand, nor was there any sign of anyone being beaten. The sound had apparently come from two boys mock sword fighting with wooden single-sticks. One was Nick, the fellow who had been the butt of the players' jokes the day before, the one who had played the queen in Hamlet, and the other was the play's Ophelia, a slender boy who was taller than I and far better suited to playing girls' parts than the swaggering Nick, who seemed to be too husky in voice and in build. Excuse me. And in build to portray anything but older women. On the other side of the room, two players were dancing a jig to a tune played on a hautboy. Nearby, Samuel and James, the two hopefuls, were turning somersaults atop a row of rush mats under the eye of a small, athletic-looking man. Mr. Phillips, Sander informed me. He's our stage manager, among other things. Mr. Armin, you already know. He gestured toward the man who had run afoul of Falconer and who had stood up for me before the other players. He was demonstrating sword positions to Nick and his partner. He nodded in our direction, and Sander approached him. "Where shall I start our new boy?" "Stramazone," Mr. Armin shouted, and I shrank back, believing we were being cursed in some foreign tongue. The two students made slicing motions with their sticks. "He may as well begin here," Mr. Armin said in a perfectly civil tone. Then he shouted, "Reversa!" The two boys cut with their sticks from the other side. "Get him a single stick." For the next hour I stood in rank with Sander and the others, facing Mr. Armin and attempting to duplicate his stance and movements. I had never had anything to do with weapons, beyond the mock skirmishes with elder sticks at the orphanage. Before long my limbs began to ache. I could sense that the others were secretly laughing at my bumbling efforts, and I longed to throw the stick aside, preferably at them, and show them my skill with a pen. But to do so, of course, would be to give myself away. I would have to continue to seem a willing prentice until I could complete my real mission here, and when I did, when I had stolen the script from under their very noses, then I would be the one to laugh. At last Mr. Armin called a halt, and he and Nick paired off. Nick was armed with a real rapier now, blunted, of course. They saluted with their swords, their faces smiling and cordial. Then Mr. Armin said, "Have at you!" And the two transformed before our eyes into deadly enemies. Their blades clashed and parted and met again, with such rapidity that my eye could scarcely follow. Sander and Ophelia cheered them on. Their sentiments were obviously with Mr. Armin, but they shouted encouragement to Nick as well. Even with my ignorance of fencing, I could see that Mr. Armin was holding back, giving Nick time to ward and counter. The fencing scene in the play had displayed the same measured pace. As with the play, I was drawn into the drama. Just as I was tempted to shout a word of encouragement myself, Mr. Armin effortlessly caught Nick's sideways blow on the guard of his rapier, flung his arm outward, and delivered a quick but gentle stoccata to Nick's unguarded chest. "Touch," he said. Nick's face, already red from exertion, grew redder. He peevishly flung down the rapier and stalked off. Mr. Armin ignored his outburst and approached us. "Do you three feel you are ready for a real weapon?" "No, sir," we said, almost as one person. "Then go practice your pasadas," he said. "We have an audience who pays to see us, and we don't need you lots standing about gawking." As we moved away, Sanders said, "Widge is going to need a bit of coaching, I think. Do you want to do it, Julian, or shall I?" Ophelia, whose name was apparently Julian, shrugged. We could take turns. All right with you, Widge? Sander asked. Unused as I was to being asked for my preferences, I took a moment to reply. Oh, I don't mind, but Mr. Armand said. Fie on what Mr. Armand said, Sander replied, but softly. I've done so many passadas I could do them in my sleep. Just be sure you do them on your side of the bed, he laughed. We'll soon have you doing them in your own sleep as well. Now, the first thing we'll have to show you is the 3 wards. 3 words? No, wards. He held up the single stick at the height of his forehead. This is high ward. I copied his stance. He moved the stick to his waist. Broad ward. His hand went down near his knee. Base ward. You might just as well show him the right way. Cook, a voice said. I turned to see Nick standing close by. Here, let me have that stick. Sander gave it up reluctantly. Nick planted himself in front of me, a distinctly unpleasant smile on his face. I'll learn you properly. Let him be, Sander said, not as forcefully as he might have. I'm only going to see if he learned his lesson, Nick said innocently. Now then, Widge, is it? You know what a widge is where I come from? My throat felt too tight to speak. I shook my head. A horse. I think I'll call you Horse, though you look more like an ass to me. Hold your stick like this, Horse, the hand close to the knee, and the tip pointing at your opponent's throat bowl. With a shaking hand, I tried to mirror his position. Get your point up, he commanded. I was slow to respond, and he whacked my stick sharply. Get the point up, I said. Get the point? I? Do I look like the captain of a ship? Nay. Ah, you can neigh like a horse as well. Now bring your your hand, in closer to your leg. Else your opponent might do this. He brought his stick swiftly down on my knuckles. With a gasp, I let my stick fall. And if you do that, he'll certainly do this. He lunged, and his stick struck my breastbone painfully. My fear gave way to anger, and I scrambled for the fallen weapon. Laughing, Nick knocked it out of my reach. When I was young at the orphanage and bigger boys taunted me, I invariably burst into tears. But finding that was an invitation to further abuse, I had learned to refrain from tears. Whatever the provocation, I even prided myself on it. Now, facing Nick, I trembled with shame and frustration, but I was dry-eyed. Pick it up, Horse, Nick ordered me with his foot. He sent it skating across the floor at me. As I hesitated, unsure whether I would look more like a fool by picking it up or by letting it lie, Julian suddenly stepped between us, his stick at Broadward. That's enough, Nick. We can all see he's no match for you. And you are, I suppose? No, the boy replied evenly, but Sander and I together may be. Nick scowled at Sander, who had taken the cue and come up behind him. That's unfair odds. So's you against Widge, Sander said. Give him a few months of practice and he'll go around with you, won't you, Widge? Though in truth I meant to be gone long before that, I nodded. Nick pointed his stick threateningly at me. Study your footwork then, hobby horse, for I mean to hobble you. And he gave a token thrust toward Sander, who jumped back, laughing. Nick tossed the stick aside and swaggered off. Only then did I notice Mr. Armand watching from across the room. Why did he not put a stop to it? I suppose, Julian said, he believes a man should fight his own battles. Then why did you step in? I said crossly. I beg your humble pardon. Next time I'll let him put a dent in your stupid pudding basin. Julian stomped away. A bit of a hothead, isn't he? Isn't he? I observed. And you're a bit of a muttonhead, Sander said mildly. He was only trying to help. I don't need any help, I said sullenly. Yes, you do. Now why don't you take up that stick and we'll start over? Hi, Ward. As I grudgingly strove to mimic his movements, he said, Nick isn't really such a bad sort, you know. He was just testing your mettle. Broadward. I don't think Nick is truly mean at heart. He's just going through a bad time. He's been apprenticed for 6 or 7 years now, and he'll have to begin playing a man's part. On the stage or in life? Both, I suppose. Low Ward. That as it may be, I said. But we can scarcely judge a person by what is like inside. It's the outside we have to do it. Sander lowered his single stick and sighed. Well, on the inside you may be a very good fencer, but on the outside you stink. I washed out last week, I protested. I washed but last week. Oh, he said, on the outside you stink. All right, so he had a bath a week ago. Sorry about that. Sander laughed. I didn't mean it literally, you goose. It means you're terrible. Come on, we'll try some passadas. It was a long morning. When Mr. Armand finally tired of trying to make us into some semblance of scrimmers, his word for swordsman, he passed us on to Mr. Phillips, who worked on our diction, mostly mine, and something called projection, which meant, as nearly as I could tell, shouting more loudly than the audience. To my relief, the afternoon was less taxing. The company was presenting a play called Every Man Out of His Humor, which fit my mood exactly. As the bookkeeper was ill, Sander was given the task of holding the playbook and throwing out lines to players who were floundering. I was posted, along with Samuel, one of the hopefuls, in the tiring room to help the players change costume. In my ignorance, I did more to hinder than to help, yet none complained except Nick. When I stepped on the hem of his gown, he aimed a blow at me. I ducked it easily. Ducking was one athletic skill I had long since mastered. Before he could try it again, his cue came. I'll see to you later, horse, he growled and swept out. His voice was so much at odds with his feminine appearance that I could not help but snicker. Such a lady, Sam said, and set us both laughing. Julian came into the tiring room, greeted us, and retreated into the wardrobe change. I stared after him. Feels as too good for us, does-a? Oh, that's nothing against us, Sam said. He's a modest one, that's all. Mr. Shakespeare's the name, and Mr. Burbage don't like others pawing at them, I guess. All right. The mention of Mr. Shakespeare brought to mind something that the day's constant activity had pushed aside, the lost script. If I did not find it soon, someone else would. Leaving Sam to take care of matters in the tiring room, I crept up the stairs to the balcony. My luck was good that day. The balcony was not in use. I drew back the drapery and inspected the spot where I'd concealed myself the day before. So much for luck. The notebook was not there. Where in heaven's name was it then? Had some member of the company found it? Then it came to me. The man in the crowd who had jostled me from behind. He had smiled so sincerely. It never occurred to me that he had dipped his thieving fingers into my wallet. Gog's bread, I murmured. I've stolen me script. The thief must have been upset to discover that he had filched not a purse but a book full of scribbles. He could hardly return it, though, and however great his frustration, it could not have held a candle to the dismay that I felt at the moment, knowing that all my work and worry was for naught. Chapter 13. Despite my exhaustion, I lay awake a long time that night, wondering how I could possibly survive another week of lessons until such time as Hamlet came around again, and how I would manage to transcribe it unobserved. I tried hard to think of some alternative. Perhaps I could copy out the players' individual parts from their sides. The problem with that was that they had all learned their parts and seldom used the sides. What about the book used to prompt players, then? But I had seen how diligently Sander guarded it, never letting out of his hands, let alone his sight. At last my battered brain succumbed to sleep. The following day, Sunday, the theater was closed. I was grateful for the day off and for the chance to sleep late. In truth, I slept only an hour or so past matins. Then several of Mr. Pope's orphans invaded our room, begging for stories and horseback rides. At first I refused, bad enough to be called horse by Nick. Now I was expected to behave as one. But when the boys pleaded with me, tugging eagerly at my sleeve, it brought to my mind a picture of myself at that age, tugging at Mistress McGregor's skirts as she handed out the contents of some charity basket. Grudgingly, I let myself be pulled down onto all fours, straddled and spurred by bare feet into a sluggish gait. Sander, burdened with a pair of riders, glanced at me and grinned broadly. I shook my head in exasperation. "Make horsey noises," my rider commanded gleefully. "Nay," I protested. The boys burst out into giggles. "That's not how horsies say it." After church, Sanders said, "We have the whole day and the whole city to our disposal. Where shall we go?" "You decide." "Well, there's a zoo in the tower with lions and tigers and a porcupine, even a camel. But all they do is sleep. We could go to Paul's instead." "Who's Paul?" "St. Paul." "St. Paul's. It's a cathedral. I'll pay for the crossing." Though the cathedral did not sound like the height of excitement to me, I had no better suggestion. It was another cobweb day, and by the time we crossed the Thames, we looked as though we had swum in it. Sanders' spirits were not dampened in the least. His long legs carried him so swiftly up the hill that I had to fairly trot to keep up. At last we came to the huge cathedral, which had attracted my awe the night of my arrival. "St. Paul's," Sanders said, "the center of things." So, now I understood. In the center of the universe, I stared about, open-mouthed, like the greenest plowboy. The chaotic courtyard of the cathedral was packed with people and vendors' booths. Voices hung in the air as densely as a misty rain. I felt the urge to hold my breath as we plunged into a sea of bodies. "Keep a firm hold on your wallet," Sanders called over the clamor. I laughed mirthlessly. "I've not left to steal," I said. "You want to go up in the tower? I'll pay." "What's there?" "A good view of the city, and a few bats." The view from the top of Paul's was, indeed, a good one. Sanders pointed out the roofs of the Queen's London residence far off to the west, and the Tower's prison to the east. Between the two lay more buildings than a man could count. The streets were as crooked and wayward as country streams, dissecting the city into not into square blocks, but into convoluted shapes of all sizes. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Sanders. "It's like a maze. How in heaven's name do you find your way about?" Sanders laughed. "It's easy when you've grown up in it." "And you like it?" "Of course, don't you?" "Perhaps I'm just not used to it yet." "You'll come to like it." He put a hand on my shoulder. I was not used to being touched in a comradely way either, and I flinched. "Sorry," he said. "I forgot that the height makes people nervous." "Aye," I said. "Let's go back down." Was it the height that made him nervous?
No.
The courtyard was no place for a person who was shy of being touched. I lost sight of Sanders temporarily, but caught up with him again at a bookseller's stall. "Here," he said, "have a look at this." Displayed prominently were a number of plays and poems written by W.M. Shakespeare. "Is that our William Shakespeare?" "Of course." Eagerly I searched for the copy of the Tragedy of Hamlet, then realized, of course, that it were bound and printed like these if it were bound and printed like these, Simon Bass would never have gone to the trouble to send me and Falconer here. He would simply have bought one. They say that if you mention the devil's name, he's likely to appear. As I turned away from the bookstall, I found that by thinking his name, I had somehow conjured up Falconer, and to my dismay, he was heading directly for us. I could not have said whether or not he saw me. As always, his hood sheltered his face. He was pushing his way impatiently through the crowd, but then he always did that. Perhaps it was not too late to avoid him. I plunged into the shifting maze of people. Sanders shouted after me, "Widge, where are you going?" I did not bother to reply. I only pressed on, burrowing through the tangle of arms and legs like a hare through briars. At last I found daylight at the edge of the courtyard and turned to look back. Falconer was a tall man. I could see the tip of his hood bobbing through the crowd. "Gog's blood," I muttered. He was on to me for certain, and he'd want the script, and perhaps my blood as well. "No excuses," he'd said. There was nothing for me to do but run, and no way to run but through the cathedral graveyard. Though I did not care for the company of dead folk, it was easier to make my way through them. I slipped as quietly as I could between headstones and crypts. The earth was soft from the rain, and in places from being recently turned up. It gave way slightly under my feet, making me fear that if I did not move quickly, I would sink down into the realm of the dead. Shuddering, I broke into a trot, never pausing until I reached solid ground. When I peered back through the drizzle, I thought I spied a dark figure weaving among the tombstones. I began to run again, with no goal but to get away. I trotted down one unknown street, then another, sending up sprays of water with each step. Finally, I sank, exhausted, onto the doorstep. If I hadn't lost Falconer by now, I never would. Unfortunately, I had lost myself as well. I had no idea in which direction Southwark lay. South, of course, but with the sun so well concealed, who could say where that was? It stood to reason, though, that if I followed the water in the gutters and kept a downhill course, I would eventually run into the Thames as well. How I would get to the far side was another matter. I would have to cross that bridge, or lack of one, when I came to it. As it turned out, my reasoning was seriously flawed. After only a few minutes' walk, I came to a massive wall that encircled the city. Even I knew that the wall did not run between St. Paul's and the Thames. By now, I was so disoriented that I kept on that street, which was at least broad and well-traveled. Finally, I found the good sense to ask an old farmer to point me in the right direction. "Turn left at the next chance," he said, "and follow your nose till you wets your toes." I thanked him and hurried on. The thoroughfare onto which I turned seemed innoxious enough, but after a time I noticed that each block was a bit more dismal looking than the last. Before long, the streets began to seem less like paths to the river than like a descent into hell. The prosperous merchants and busy tradesmen had disappeared, and in their place were coarse women and menacing men, bands of noisy, grimy children, and scores of beggars. Lining both sides of the street were ramshackle booths and huts constructed of any material that would keep out the weather: hides, sticks, mud. My impulse was to turn and retrace my steps, but I told myself I could not possibly be far from the river now, so I kept on, dodging piles of muck. I did not see the two youths until they were directly before me, blocking my path. My immediate impression was that they were large of body, with large grinning mouths and large daggers at their belts. Separately, each would have been daunting. Together, they were terrifying. I stepped back. They stepped forward. I stepped aside. They followed. What do you want?" "What have you got?" one of them said. "Naught but the clothes on my back." He fingered the hilt of his dagger. "We'll have that, then." Oh dear, they're going to steal his clothes. All right. Questions. The people Widge encounters at the Globe frequently surprise him in the way they act and respond to different situations. For example, Widge is a little thrown off when Julian stands up for him in the fencing match against Nick. How does Widge typically expect people to respond?
Just ignore him.
Yep. What does this tell you about what his life has been like up to this point?
Not that great.
Yes. Widge, sadly, expects to see the more negative sides of people. He thought the sounds of blowing coming from the room were people being beaten. When he was more a hindrance than a help during costume changes, he was surprised that no one complained. His life as apprentice up to this point was rough enough that he expects people to act negatively toward him and is continually surprised when they don't. How does Widge discover the likely true fate of his notebook?
When he remembered that the guy just bumped into him and stole it.
Yep, he finally got a chance to search up in the balcony where he feared he'd lost it. And that's when he remembered. Do you know what to do if you find yourself unexpectedly separated from your parents in a public place?
Stay where you are and hope they find you.
All right, you can talk to a police officer, or a mother with children is generally a pretty safe person to ask for help. And it says that you should review your family's plan for what to do if somebody gets missing. So what does Widge do that you should not do if you know you are lost?
Keep going.
Mm-hmm. Keep walking and hope to find his way back.
Right. Keep continuing to walk in a direction when you have no idea where you're going is not good. And when it seemed like the neighborhood was getting really sketchy, he probably should have turned around or found a different way to go or something. All right, that is it for today. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.